$15,000 a year. But the point is, I would say to the senator from Louisiana, there are millions of seniors for whom that is either all or almost all of their income. That's it. That's it. And in this day and age, that's the average. So your point is there are people certainly below the average.
I asked the senator that because it really is striking to me that some members from the other side of the aisle will come and argue that programs like this should be slated for cuts and reductions and yet fail to vote favorably to raise slightly the income tax on families making over $1 million a year in annual income. I frankly, Senator, don't understand that. I'm not sure people listening to this understand it. Could you enlighten us?
Well, here's the story. I agree with you, and I find it hard to understand that there are people who get up here, and we hear the speeches every day, and they say, we have a serious deficit crisis. It is unfair to leave that burden to our kids and our grandchildren. We agree with that. And we say, okay, let's address the deficit crisis, but let's do it in a way that is not on the backs of the sick, the elderly, the children, the most vulnerable people in this country. So what the senator from Louisiana is pointing out, that in the last number of years, what we have seen is that the people on top have been doing very, very well. The top 1% now earns about 23% of all income, which is more than the bottom 50%. The effective tax rate for the very wealthiest people in this country is about 16%, which is the lowest in recent history. And we have given huge amounts of tax breaks in recent years to these very same people. So what I think the senator from Louisiana is saying, and I agree with her, is if we are going to go forward with deficit reduction, which you and I agree we should, let's do it in a way that calls for shared sacrifice. The senator from Louisiana knows that H.R. 1, the Republican House-passed bill, would throw over 200,000 kids off of Head Start. Millions of students who are trying to get through college would either get lower Pell Grants or no Pell Grants at all. It is an attack, a devastating attack, a cruel attack against some of the most vulnerable people in this country. They're cutting back on the women, infant, and children nutrition program. You got low-income women now. We're trying to make sure that they don't give birth to low-weight babies. Cut back on that program. But when we say, well, maybe billionaires who are doing phenomenally well might be asked to pay a little bit more in taxes, oh, my word, we have none of that at all. So the issue is shared sacrifice. Don't balance the budget on the backs of the weak and the vulnerable.
I thank the senator from Vermont for that eloquent description and very accurate description of the situation that we're in. I see the senator from Oklahoma that's here for an amendment, and we really want to keep these amendments being discussed, so I thank the senator from Oklahoma for joining us.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
So the chairman knows my planned time to introduce those amendments is 3:30. That's what they've given me a time, and I'll do that. But I did want to engage some of the comments of the senator from Vermont. As somebody who was on the Deficit Commission and looking at that, the first presumption is making Social Security solvent was our goal, making it solvent for 75 years. The flaw in the argument given by my colleague from Vermont is the assumption that the IOU at the Treasury for Social Security is good. It's good as long as people will loan us money. It's not any good if they won't. And so when people say, why fix Social Security? We can fix Social Security by taking the very haircut from the people the senator from Vermont just described and markedly lessening the benefits, even though they continue to pay into Social Security, that they'll receive, the billionaires and the millionaires. We can do that. But if, in fact, we don't send a signal to the international financial community on the largest expenditure we have that we're going to make it solvent, then we won't be in the market and available and have the ability to borrow the $2.8 trillion. Now, one other thing that I would disagree on, the Social Security Trust Fund trustees have said Social Security is running a net deficit last year, We'll run one this year and from every year forward in terms of what comes in versus what goes out. There's no question I want to keep our commitments. And nobody's talking about eliminating benefits except to the very rich in this country in terms of Social Security. As a matter of fact, the Deficit Commission raised the benefits in Social Security for the poorest in this country. So we actually did the opposite of what the senator claims that Republicans might want to do. What we have to do is to make sure Social Security is viable for the future. And having looked at every aspect of Social Security, I can tell you if we're not able to borrow the $2.6 trillion, the benefits won't be there. And so although the money has been stolen from, there's no trust fund, there's no money there. If you read what the head of the OMB said in 1999, he said it's not there. So what's really happened in Social Security? Congresses under both Republican and Democrat control, both Republican and Democrat presidencies have stolen money from Social Security and spent it. The money's gone. It's been used for another purpose. So there's two ways of solving that. One is to make Social Security the priority and not fund anything but that till we get it paid back, or actually fund that $2.6 trillion by going to the debt market, which we will go every year from now forward under the present plan of Social Security. The rate of taxes between now and 2035 that will be taxed will rise from $106,000 or $7,000 now to $168,000 between now and then. That is a 60% increase in the taxes on the wealthy that is planned and programmed right now. Even with that, Social Security will run a deficit every year. Every year, now forward. Even with the $2.8 trillion, it still is in a negative cash flow. So to deny the fact, if we don't want to fix Social Security, then what we're saying is we don't want to fix it for our children's children or our children. And I'd like to finish my point. It's not about taking something away except from the very wealthy. The fix from the Deficit Commission. That's what it did. And we also added back is when you reach 80 and a lot of people may be running out of their combination of what their retirement was plus their Social Security, we give another little bump. So what the Deficit Commission did was significantly increase the viability for Social Security for the next 75 years. And there is no, the Social Security trustees know we have to do this. Everybody knows we have to do this. And the question is does this Congress owe that $2.8 trillion back to the Social? Yeah. But where do we get the money to repay it? And unless we can calm the international financial markets down, where we make major change, not just in Social Security, in discretionary spending, $50 billion out of the Pentagon, modifying Medicare to where we get the fraud, waste, and abuse out of Medicare, unless we do those things, we're not going to be able to borrow the money. One final fact, and then I'll yield back to my chairman because I have a meeting. My colleague, I have a meeting to go. So far, in the last 5 months, who do you think has bought our bonds to finance the deficit? We ran a $223 billion deficit in the month of February. Who bought them? Was it Chinese? Who was the biggest buyer? You know who the biggest buyer was? The Federal Reserve bought 70% of the bonds that we put on the market. What are they doing? They're debasing our currency and creating future inflation, which will hurt the very people who are going to be on Social Security, because the cost of living index will never truly keep up with the real cost of inflation. And all of us have gotten letters from our constituents wondering why there was no COLA. Right? We know why there was no COLA. But when you look at food and transportation costs and what they've done in the last 3 years, that's the thing that's important to seniors. Their health care costs, their housing costs, their food costs. And yet we have a COLA system that says we're not going to recognize that. So if, in fact, we get into a hyperinflation because the Federal Reserve's buying the bonds because nobody else will buy them, right now 70%, 30% are bought in the market. Final point. The largest bond trader in the world, PIMCO, last week sold every U.S. government bond they have. You know why? They expect the price of the bond to go down because they expect the interest rate to go up. What happens to us if we don't fix Social Security is the interest rates are going to be a lot higher on our debt. And if they're a lot higher and we owe $14 trillion, for every 1% increase in the cost of borrowing that we have, it adds to our deficit $140 billion. So I'm honored that Senator Sanders is adamant about making sure we keep our commitments. But in terms of cash flow, it isn't there. And we have to address that. And the only way we create the confidence is for the international financial community to say, you have a solvent program for 75 years, the largest segment of your expenditures. We get it. We're going to loan you money. If we don't do that, the interest costs are going to be higher, and we're going to pay for it anyway. So right now, we're almost to the point where our decisions are not going to be controlled by us. And I'd rather us be in a situation where they're controlled. This isn't a partisan issue. There isn't one senator that wants to take money away from needy seniors who are on Social Security or somebody coming. This is about making changes far down the road that will affect people 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, and it makes sense to do it. And with that, I yield back to the senator from Vermont.
I thank my friend from Oklahoma. Let me just make a few points, if I might. Are you leaving, Senator? Okay. Then we'll continue the dialogue. But I did want to make a few points. Number one, the senator from Oklahoma gave his understanding about what the Debt Commission would do to Social Security. I do not agree with his characterization of what that commission does. In point of fact, what the Debt Commission does do is cut retirement benefits by more than 35% for young workers entering the workforce today. 35%. Today's 20-year-old workers who retire at age 65 would see their benefits cut by 17% if their wages average $43,000 over their working lives, by 30% if their wages average $69,000 over their working lives, and by 36% if their wages average $107,000 over their working lives, according to the Social Security chief actuary. The proposed cuts would apply to retirees, disabled workers and their families, children who have lost parents, and widows and widowers. So it is not accurate to say that the Debt Commission left unscathed workers. Quite the contrary. Devastating cuts to young workers. But let us answer the question. If the senator from Oklahoma wants to make sure that Social Security is financially solvent for the next 75 years, which I agree with, I want to see that as well, there is an easy way to do it, there is a fair way to do it, and it's a way that doesn't require slashing benefits for younger workers. When Barack Obama ran for President of the United States, he had a pretty good idea. I hope he still has that idea. And what he said is that it is important to understand that right now somebody making $1 million a year pays the same amount of money into the Social Security Trust Fund as somebody who makes $106,000. If you lift that cap, start at $250,000, ask those people to contribute into the Social Security Trust Fund, you will go a very long way to solving the financial solvency of Social Security. I think we should do that. That is certainly not what the Deficit Reduction Commission did do. Let me deal with this issue just very briefly, I say to the senator from Louisiana. We keep hearing that the Social Security Trust Fund just has a pile of worthless IOUs. The fact of the matter is that Social Security invests the surplus money it receives from workers, from the payroll tax, into U.S. government bonds, the same bonds that China or anybody else purchases. And these bonds are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government and in our entire history, and many of us want to make sure this continues, the United States government has never defaulted on its debt obligations. So the point is to say that these are worthless IOUs. It is not dissimilar to say, well, gee whiz, guess what? Because we have a deep deficit and a deep national debt, we don't have any money to fund equipment for our soldiers who are out in the field in Afghanistan or Iraq. That's just worthless IOUs. We can't fund them. That's, of course, nonsense. So do we have to address the deficit crisis? Yes, we do. But my friend from Oklahoma did not respond to the issue of why, if he and his friends are so concerned about our deficit crisis, they vote year after year for hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country. They want to repeal the estate tax, which will provide $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 0.3%. With that, Madam Chair, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President, I think this has been a very
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I think this has been a very interesting debate on one of our amendments, but it really gets to the heart of the larger amendment here on Capitol Hill and in the minds of all Americans. How are we going to close this budget deficit, annual deficits, and how are we going to substantially reduce the national debt? And I'm actually pleased that this discussion is taking place on this bill. I think it's appropriate because this bill's intention, its underlying intention, is to close that gap by creating jobs, because there's some of us around here that actually believe and know, although there are arguments on the other side, they're not very strong, that you can accomplish that by cutting discretionary spending alone. The senator from Kentucky, Senator Rand, was here arguing sort of along that line that if we just accept his amendment, which I will strongly object to, and cut $200 billion out of the discretionary side of the budget, that will get us, you know, in the direction we need to be. All that will do is eat the seed corn that this country needs to invest in important things like infrastructure and education to secure our future for our children and grandchildren. And I want to remind senators that since 1982, military discretionary spending has never dropped below 5.5% in any given year. So since 1982, non-military discretionary spending has never dropped by more than 5.5% in any given year. Senator Paul's amendment, if adopted, I doubt that it will be, would propose a 50% reduction in the discretionary funding of education, energy, housing, and urban development. It is a drastic cut that would not support a foundation for growth and expansion. But having said that, the other thing that is offensive to that approach is that there never seems to be a discussion of reduction of military budgets when it comes to waste, fraud, and abuse. There are billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars documented in the Defense Department by the Secretary of Defense himself that people object to, trying to get to a balanced budget. And then we have members that are trying to use the Social Security situation to argue for their point that the roof is falling in, the world is collapsing, and we've got to cut back on Social Security. I want to add to what Senator Sanders said and clarify something, and I do respect Senator Colburn. No member has worked harder on the issue of deficits and debt reduction, and I don't agree with all the things that he suggests, but I most certainly recognize effort when I see it, and Senator Colburn has most certainly put in the effort. But when he says that the Social Security program is running a deficit in terms of the money in and the money out, he's correct. But as Senator Sanders pointed out, the reason is because the federal government used the surplus over the last 15 or 20 years to fund other operations of the government. But the Social Security program itself is intact, and when that money is paid back, it will have a surplus. So using the fact that it's running an annual deficit to argue for either cutting benefits to Social Security or cutting benefits from education or for health to pay for Social Security is not a legitimate argument. Again, Social Security is intact. It is actually running a surplus. If they would have a surplus right now in the account if the money had been left there. And it continues to amaze me, and this will be the last thing I say, that even in this discussion, we never, ever hear from the other side the willingness to raise $50 billion if we're trying to get to $100 billion in cuts. Some people want to get to 200, but we'd like to close the gap by anywhere from, 10 to 100 billion. If you wanted to get 50 of that billion by raising the income tax on people that make over $1 million, we could get halfway to 100 billion by doing that. But we never hear that. We just hear cut Social Security benefits, cut education, cut health care, cut Pell Grants, cut Homeland Security, and it just, I don't think the American people, I know that we have to cut back on spending. I know that we have to get our deficit under control. And I know that our debt is too high, but we're not going to achieve the goal of fiscal responsibility by just cutting discretionary spending on the domestic side, which means cutting Head Start, Pell Grants, and education, and adamantly refusing to raise the income tax for people in this country that make over $1 million. So this is going to be a very interesting debate over the next couple of weeks. It won't be settled on this bill, the SBIR bill, but it will be settled sometime in the next couple of weeks in this Congress. And I, for one, am looking forward to that debate, and I think the American people need to have an open and honest debate about what is actually going on in this country. I'm going to suggest the absence of a quorum, and others may come to the floor to speak on other subjects. I see Senator Grassley here, so let me take back the quorum and say Senator Grassley is free to speak on this or other matters.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I believe that there is an amendment been submitted that hopefully we will vote on called the McConnell Amendment, which basically takes away from the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. The Environmental Protection Agency gets this power from a Supreme Court decision that said they had the authority to do that. That Supreme Court decision was about 2 or 3 years ago, came about 16 or 17 years after the 1990 Clean Air Act was passed. Those of us that were around here and debated and worked on the Clean Air Act of 1990 don't remember any discussion about EPA under that legislation having the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. But obviously the Supreme Court read the law different than we do. And so the Environmental Protection Agency was told you can regulate greenhouse gases. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency didn't have to do that, but I suppose they're like regulators generally. You know, you kind of say, why do cows moo? Why do pigs squeal? And why do regulators regulate? Because regulators know how to regulate, and that's all they know how to do. And so they're going to issue a regulation if they got the authority to do it. The situation is this. If we don't take away the authority and, in a sense, overturn the Supreme Court case, EPA is going to put us in a position to be economically uncompetitive with the rest of the world, particularly in manufacturing. When you increase the cost of energy by anywhere from $1,800 under one study to $3,000 under another study per household, you're very dramatically increasing the cost of production of manufacturing. And if you're too many manufacturing jobs going overseas, and we would let the EPA follow through with what they want to do, increasing the cost of energy, we will lose all of our manufacturing overseas. And I haven't checked the record, but my guess is that a lot of my colleagues that are fighting the McConnell Amendment and think it's not the right thing to do are the very same people that are very chagrined and blaming American industry because jobs are going overseas. Well, if we're going to pass a law that increases the cost of energy in this country, we're not going to have a level playing field with our competitors overseas. And that's why I've always said if you want to regulate CO2, you need to do it by international agreement. Because if China's not on the same level playing field as we are, then we're going to lose our manufacturing to China and other countries. And it happens that China puts more CO2 in the air than we do. And you take China and Brazil and India and Indonesia, and they put a lot more CO2 into the United States or into the air than the United States does. And yet somehow EPA is of the view that the United States can cut down and solve the global warming problem. Well, even the EPA director has testified before committees of Congress that if the rest of the world doesn't do it, we're not going to make a dent in CO2 just by the United States doing it. But the argument goes that the United States ought to show political leadership in this global economy we have, and if the United States would do something about CO2, the rest of the world would follow along. But China's already said they weren't going to follow along. Even Japan, that signed on to the Kyoto Treaty, said that they wouldn't be involved in extending the Kyoto Treaty beyond 2012. And so if the United States did it by itself under the guise of being a world leader and setting an example, and the rest of the world didn't do it, Uncle Sam would soon become Uncle Sucker. And we would find our manufacturing fleeing the United States to places where they don't have regulation on CO2, where energy expenses aren't so high, and would lose the jobs accordingly. And in a sense, then, those people that have complained for decades about American manufacturing moving overseas would destine the United States to do more of it. And so I don't understand how people that are concerned about losing jobs overseas could be fighting the McConnell Amendment. Because if you want to preserve jobs in America, our industry has to be competitive with the rest of the world. So I hope that the McConnell Amendment will be adopted, and I hope there will be some consistency in the reasoning of people who are concerned about the movement of jobs overseas, that it's intellectually dishonest to support EPA adopting regulations that's going to make America uncompetitive. There's nothing wrong with seeking a solution to the CO2 problem. There's nothing wrong with seeking, working on the issue of global warming. But it ought to be a level playing field for American industry so that we can be competitive with the rest of the world and not lose our industry, not lose our manufacturing overseas, and not losing the jobs that are connected with it. But it often is the case that when either the courts or the Congress delegates broad powers to the executive branch agencies, it seems like you give them an inch and they take a mile. And there are plenty of other examples as well, and I'll go into some of them in just a moment, of EPA having some authority and moving very dramatically in a way that doesn't meet the common sense test. And the work of EPA on CO2 is a perfect example of first of all, they didn't have to do it just because the Supreme Court said that they could do it, but like regulators, they want to regulate. And they're moving ahead. I suppose they're moving ahead also because in 2009, the House of Representatives passed a bill regulating CO2, a bill that would have made the United States very uncompetitive, as I've stated the EPA will, but the Senate didn't take it up. And I think this administration is intent upon getting the job done, and so they go to EPA, issue a rule because Congress isn't passing legislation. It's so typical of so many things that this administration is doing that because Congress won't pass a law, that we'll see what we can do by regulation. And so they're setting out to accomplish a lot of change in public policy because Congress won't act, but they're going to act anyway. And if they have the authority to do it, they'll probably get away with it. You know, avoid the will of the people. The will of the people expressed through the Congress of the United States. So the will of the people, Congress doesn't do something. So can the administration ignore the will of the people? Yeah, they can if they want to, but they should not, in my judgment. And it brings me to not only the McConnell Amendment, but a lot of other things that we should be doing around here to prevent this outrageous overreach by not only the Environmental Protection Agency, but by a lot of other agencies as well. Because when the EPA and other agencies promulgate rules that go beyond the intent of Congress and never should have passed, it undermines our system of checks and balances. The American people can hold their Congress accountable for passing laws that they don't like. However, when unelected bureaucrats implement policies with the force of law that they would not have been able to get through the Congress, and that's without direct accountability when a regulator acts instead of Congress acting, these policies that take effect do something that's very wrong when it's against the will of the people. So I think it's time for Congress to reassert its constitutional role. We try to do this from time to time on a process called the congressional veto. I recall last June, the senator from Alaska, Senator Murkowski, proposed doing that on these very rules affecting CO2. We did not get a majority vote, so it didn't happen. Now, maybe in the new Congress, such an attempt would get a majority vote. And if we can't apply that congressional veto again to those rules, then that brings about the McConnell Amendment that I'm speaking about, to take away the authority of EPA to do it. But perhaps we can use the congressional veto on a lot of other issues yet that regulators are regulating maybe against the will of the people, and I hope we will. But there's one that Senator Paul has suggested that I ask unanimous consent to be added as a co-sponsor to Amendment 231.
Without objection.
That would be the, he uses the acronym REINS, R-E-I-N-S, but it's called the Regulation from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, or and basically what it does, and I applaud Senator Paul for his amendment, and I will surely vote for it, and that is that we delegate authority to agencies in the executive branch of government to write regulations. If those regulations are considered quote-unquote major regulations, then they would have to be submitted to the Congress for our approval before they can go into effect, and then would also have to be signed by the President before they would go into effect. It seems to me that that's a natural extension of Congress's authority under the Constitution to legislate and to be the only branch of government that can legislate. And it seems to me to be a very adequate check on out-of-control bureaucracy that they can only do those things that Congress intended they do in the legislation they pass. I would extend my remarks on something a little bit unrelated to the McConnell Amendment, but still to the overreach of the Environmental Protection Agency. And this is in regard to some of their regulations and agriculture. And when it comes to their regulation of agriculture, instead of EPA standing for Environmental Protection Agency, I think it stands for End Production Agriculture. Now, that's not their intent. But in this city of Washington, and I describe it sometimes as an island surrounded by reality, that it's an evidence of not enough common sense being put into the thought process of issuing regulations. And I could give several examples, but I may just give a few. But before I give those examples, I want to compliment EPA on one thing. After a year or two ago that one of their subdivision heads testified before Congress, and the issue was agriculture, and she said, I'd never been on a family farm in the 20-some years that they'd been working in EPA and yet dealing with agricultural issues. I invited her to a family farm, and she came and showed a great deal of interest, and we had a very thorough tour of some facilities, research, agriculture, and biofuels industries within our state, and they were very thankful that we did it. And I believe that it has helped their consideration of the impact that maybe some of their regulation writing has on agriculture. But still, I'm not totally convinced. And so I would use one or two examples of regulation that's out of control. And one of them would deal with what I call the fugitive dust issue. Now, fugitive dust is a term that EPA uses to regulate what they call particulate matter. And the theory behind fugitive dust rules is that if you're making dust that is harmful, then you have to keep it within your property line. So let's see the reality of that. You're farming, the wind's blowing, and you got to work in the fields. And the wind's blowing so hard that you can't keep the dust when you're tilling the fields within your property line. Well, are you supposed to not farm? Are you supposed to not raise food? Are you supposed to not be concerned about the production of food that's so necessary to our national defense and the social cohesion of our society? Because, you know, we're only 9 meals away from a revolution. If you go 9 meals without eating, you know, and you don't have prospects of it, are you going to be able to have revolts like they do in other countries because they don't have enough food? No, we have a stable supply of food in this country, so we don't have to worry about it. But suppose we did have to worry about it. Well, there's more to farming than just the prosperity of rural America, the national defense and social cohesion and all those things. But the point is that they're thinking about issuing a rule. In fact, they've started a process down the road 2 or 3 years ago of issuing a rule, maybe a year or two from now. Hopefully they'll decide not to. That says that you got to keep the dust within your property line. So I just wonder, when I talk about the common sense that's lacking in this big city, not just only in EPA, but in a lot of agencies, do they realize that only God determines when the wind blows? Do they realize that only God determines when soybeans have 13% moisture in September or October, and at 13% moisture you got to harvest them, and you only have about 2 or 3 days of ideal weather to harvest them? And that when you combine soybeans, dust happens. And if dust happens and you can't keep it within your property lines, you're going to violate the EPA regulations. What are you supposed to do, shut down and let a whole year's supply of food stay in the field? No. Good business practices would say that when beans get to 13% moisture, whether the wind's blowing or not, you're going to take your combine out into the field and not worry about the dust. And does somebody down at EPA think that, that John Deere's and Caterpillar and New Holland and all those companies are thinking about, well, we got this problem, EPA's, we got to do something about the dust and we got to control it coming out of our combines or when our our tillage equipment goes across the field? We have to consider the dust that comes up from tilling the fields. Well, we've asked these manufacturers. They don't have any solutions to these problems, and I think they probably think it's ridiculous after 6,000 years of agriculture throughout our society that it's really an issue. But there's people down at EPA that thinks it's an issue. And so I use the fugitive dust thing as one example of do they realize what they're doing to production agriculture. Another one would be the spilt milk. You know, milk has fat in it. And so now they're saying that, dairy farmers, well, if they have above-the-ground tanks to store their milk, they're just like above-the-ground oil tanks, and they're going to have the same regulation applied to them as applied to petroleum. Now, the compliance requirements on this have been delayed pending action on an exemption, so maybe this won't go through. But just think how ridiculous it is that people at the Environmental Protection Agency are saying that if you're a dairy farmer and you happen to spill a little milk, you have to follow the same environmental requirements as an oil company if they spilled oil and the cleanup of that. But that's where we are on these sort of rules. I've got other examples like atrazine, the application of Chesapeake Bay requirements on Chesapeake Bay applicable to the rest of the country as other examples. But I hope that we will take a look at this McConnell amendment that spoke about carbon dioxide, plus the examples I gave of the harm that EPA regulations are going to be doing to just family farming, and stop to think about we've got to find ways to stop EPA from doing things that just don't make common sense. And I think a start would be to vote for the McConnell amendment. And I'm going to vote for it. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate continues to consider amendments to the small business bill. Earlier today, 2 amendments were approved, one supporting a 5% cut in the Senate budget and another eliminating the federal charter for the National Veterans Business Development Corporation. Funding for the federal government runs out on Friday, and the Senate is expected to take up another temporary spending measure to avoid a government shutdown. The House passed it earlier this week. The Associated Press writing that Senator McConnell says that while he'll support a 3-week temporary spending measure in a vote this week, any further legislation to fund the government will have to include the $500 billion plus Pentagon budget. The Kentucky Republican also said House GOP leaders have assured him that any future government funding bill, whether it's a full-year measure endorsed by President Obama or another stopgap measure, it'll contain the defense money. The Senate continues to consider a small business research bill. Amendments include proposals to repeal an unpopular tax reporting requirement enacted as part of the 2010 healthcare overhaul, and another to bar the EPA from regulating greenhouse gas emissions. That from a summary in Congressional Quarterly. Right now, the House is voting to end the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. The program provides funds to local governments to buy and redevelop foreclosed and abandoned homes. A bill prohibiting federal funding of National Public Radio is expected to come to the floor of the House on Thursday. The bill would also bar the use of federal funds to acquire radio content. As always, the House is on C-SPAN. As we wait for a senator to speak, a headline in Congressional Quarterly, lawmakers question U.S. nuclear safety standards. The story goes on to say that as Japan struggles to contain a string of fires and explosions at an earthquake-damaged nuclear power plant, lawmakers are asking whether U.S. facilities could withstand a similar natural catastrophe. Democrat Dianne Feinstein of California says she's particularly concerned that 2 nuclear plants in her state near San Luis Obispo are designed to withstand earthquakes of only up to a magnitude 7 and 7.5. The earthquake that devastated Japan last week measured 9. Senator Feinstein saying that they very well may have hearings on that. President Obama heading out of the country on Friday. Saturday and Sunday he'll be in Brazil, and on Monday, Chile, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, he'll be in El Salvador.